know, on January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro, Batista flees Cuba. A week later, Fidel Castro comes in, and everybody was expecting a democracy, a restoration of the Constitution of 1940. But almost from the get-go, without going into too much detail, it turned out to be something very different. Besides postponing elections, abolishing political parties, we all of a sudden start to see show trials, executions on television, and there's a lot of, and of course, show trials without following any legal process. And a lot of people knew right away, this is something very different. This is not what we were expecting. Castro had appointed a cabinet filled with Democratic figures, and then by mid-year, they were all purged. They were being replaced by communists at different levels of government, and then kind of a panic broke out. What direction is this going in? And it was very clear, and I think you can sum it up without going into a lot of detail, by saying what I often say is that communism entered Cuba inside a democratic Trojan horse, because it was a matter of weeks or months before these communists started to jump out of this horse, and well-known communist figures. By mid-year and by the fall, many of Castro's former allies, besides the political figures that had been purged or that had left the government, you also had members of the rebel armed forces who were now leaving, who were being arrested, who were being put in prison, who were fleeing into exile, who were founding opposition groups even before the end of 1959. And certainly there was fear that this was communism, that this was a manipulation. The feel was different. The streets are filled now with militant followers, youth organizations, and everything starts to be militarized around this ideal and this idea of the revolution, a certain fanaticism, which isn't what was supposed to happen. What was supposed to happen was a restoration of liberal democracy, right? And instead, you're getting this militant movement. 1960, everything happened very quickly. In 1960, in February, Anastas Mikoyan, the Soviet leader, first deputy premier, visits Cuba on a very famous visit. He meets with Fidel Castro. He helps open a scientific exhibit. And of course, this was confirmation of what everybody had suspected. Cuba is going communist. Within weeks, trade agreements with the Soviet Union, an alliance with the Soviet Union, and there was absolute alarm. That spring, all of Cuba's media, Cuba had one of the best media sectors in the Western Hemisphere. Television, radio, print, a tremendously free culture, very developed, all of it within months. Every newspaper, every radio station, every television station taken over by the government. The University of Havana's autonomy, right, abolished, and the government essentially taking over the university, firing 2/3 of its professors. We start to see later in that year the establishment of the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, which were block by block vigilant groups meant to spy on neighbors who were acting in a counter-revolutionary manner, right? This is the government doing this. We see the establishment of the militia, right? A citizens' militia marching up and down the street, defending the revolution, defending Castro, condemning those who were not as enthusiastic as they were, trying to say nothing about those who were against them or who were perceived to be against them. Suddenly, there's this physical force in the street. There isn't somebody on the radio, there isn't someone on TV, criticizing people who aren't with the government. This is an actual armed force in the street, in front of your house, outside of your church, or whatever it was. And things were getting very scary. And then you had youth organizations that were doing the same thing, and it's pressuring young people to join these groups. Beyond this, you had, in the fall of 1960, another sweeping takeover of private businesses, banks, rental property, etc. And things were being radicalized, and it wasn't just ideological, physical force on the streets of militia, of CDRs, etc. And for parents seeing those youth organizations in the street, they knew enough to know that communism is going to seek to take the children, remove the parents' authority, whether literally or virtually, right, to create the next generation of competent. And that wasn't only offensive to the parents, I think, because who are you to take over raising my kid? But you're also going to form him in a way that we find offensive and that we are against. But there was the real threat that the schools were going to be taken over, that the government was going to take over the education system and close all the private schools as well, that parental authority was going to be taken. There was a lot of pressure, especially on religious schools, and a lot of harassment of religious schools. We start to see an anti-clerical campaign, anti-religious campaign, anti-Catholic school campaign, and a lot of people knew that, and the Catholic schools had become almost the last bastion where kids could be protected, right, from what was happening in the street, and those are under threat. In 1961, it would be declared the Year of Education, and the Year of Education meant that they were going to close down all the schools, right, temporarily. And during that time, the young people who knew how to read were going to be organized and taken out into the country to teach the peasants how to read and make them literate. And that sounds wonderful because on the surface, how could you be against literacy? But the irony is that this is done about a year after the government took over the entire media. So the only thing people could read and see in Cuba was what the government put out. So it was almost to facilitate propaganda, and it was a show. Cuba had an almost 80% literacy rate at the time, one of the highest in the entire hemisphere. This wasn't so much about those who were illiterate, it was more about the teachers. We're going to organize young people, organize them into brigades. It was the first mass mobilization of communist Cuba. And the point is we're going to separate the teachers, who were teenagers, from their parents, right? And we're going to use that time to indoctrinate them into revolutionary ideals while they are teaching and, in this supposed Peace Corps type environment, right? And that and of course, meantime, we're organizing the new schools that are going to open later on. And of course, those new schools are going to form the new man and the new woman of the revolution, of the now communist revolution. So there was a lot of panic in Cuba, but already by 1959, 1960, it was there, and it's only going to get worse. And by the way, everything the parents predicted, everything they saw coming, it was prophetic. Not only did it actually happen, but it was actually worse than they had imagined. And I want to emphasize that because the Cuban government's argument, because they have to come up with responses to things, right? And here you have relatively normal, middle class, mostly parents, rational people, who were pushed into taking the drastic step of taking their children, and a lot of you know how overprotective Cuban parents are. These kids, who probably most of them wouldn't have been allowed to take the bus by themselves, right? Putting them on an airplane by themselves and trusting faith and the Catholic Church and the United States to raise them. I mean, imagine what that's letting your kid go. How bad do things have to be? And of course, the Cuban government has to explain that years later, right? So they make it look like, all those parents were, you couldn't say that they were all counter-revolutionaries and evil people, because they were normal people. So the only thing it could be, it was the United States' fault, right? The United States and the CIA, in a propaganda game, made up this whole thing and put all this fear into the minds of parents, right? And it was all false. And they did it to undermine the revolution, etc., which of course, all you have to do is look at what actually happened, right? Look what happened to people who fit the Pedro Pan profile, who stayed in Cuba, who couldn't get out, right? Because they shut the flags of whatever it was. We have the UMAP camps, the forced labor camps, right? And every atrocity you can imagine committed against youth in a totalitarian society. I'm not even going to list them because I'm down to 3 minutes. Okay, okay, actually occurred in communist Cuba. Now, very quickly on the United States side, I wish I had more time, but by 1960, there was already a refugee crisis in Miami with people leaving. Monsignor Brian Walsh was the head of the Catholic Welfare Bureau. He's seeing the crisis in other social service agencies, convinced that there's going to be unaccompanied children sooner or later, which would have fallen under his purview. In November 1960, they bring a 15-year-old boy who'd been on the street, whose parents had sent him to prevent communist indoctrination, and he felt that more would come. He was able to put together a system with other social welfare agencies and the federal government that if unaccompanied children arrive, okay, there would be federal money, and that federal money would be used to fund private religious organizations to provide care, right? Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant, right? In the meantime, James Baker, the head of Ruskin Academy in Havana, was working with the Cuban underground. He had come to Miami to establish a temporary boarding school for the children of underground operatives who felt that the government would go after their children if they couldn't catch them. He meets Father Walsh. Father Walsh convinces him to drop the idea of a boarding school, that he had the promise of federal funds, he had a system, he had a blueprint in case Cuban kids started showing up. They agreed to work together. Mr. Baker went back to Cuba with a plan with Walsh to bring over 200 kids with student visas. Remember, the United States and Cuba still had diplomatic relations, right? He went back. I'm not going to go through the whole history of that because we don't have time, but the point is a few kids were able to leave, but Cuba and the United States broke diplomatic relations 6 weeks later or so, in early January 1960. So everybody thought it was over, but Mr. Baker was in a committee in Havana to continue this effort. By getting the children out via Jamaica with British visas and on KLM Airlines. They had connections to the British and the Dutch. He showed up in Miami with this idea. Walsh goes to Washington to see if they can do it. The State Department says, yes, you can, and by the way, how would you like visa waivers? Okay, so I'm going to go over by 1 minute. Right, well, what were the visa waivers? This was an incredible thing. A visa waiver was something that the United States issued in emergency cases, once every 15 blue moons in case of an emergency. But it represented a loophole because there were a lot of Cubans in Cuba who wanted to leave, and the United States was interested in helping them leave. So the United States said, why don't we issue visa waivers to Cuba? The United States issued over 400,000 visa waivers in just a couple of years, right, to all Cubans. But to get a visa waiver, you had to have a first-degree relative in the United States, ask for one, they cost money, have to be Cuba, right, and a lot of people got out with the visa waivers. The difference between what Walsh was given is that Walsh was given the authority to produce visa waivers on Catholic Welfare Bureau letterhead, and he was authorized to sign visa waivers, right, which is incredible. Walsh didn't work for the State Department, right? He was a priest, and yet he had the right to do that. So most of the Pedro Pan kids are going to come over with these visa waivers. Walsh, of course, is going to get those federal funds eventually. With that, later it's going to be attached to the Cuban refugee program, and with that, he's going to build a small network of camps in Miami for the children, which turned out to be more transit centers, because this thing is going to grow and grow and grow. He's going to create a network all across the United States, whether 48 states want it, and Puerto Rico, of foster homes, group homes, I mean, you name it. I don't know how many Catholic dioceses, I forget now, but this 30-year-old priest put together this unprecedented program, not only to bring these children out of Cuba and to help these parents, but also to provide for care for about half of them. And I do want to point this out, on another note, again, in response to some of the counter arguments. The number of families who were leaving Cuba to protect their kids during these years was off the charts in numbers. We all, those of us who grew up in the community know how many families, we could probably name 5 or so, who left Cuba, mother, father, children, to protect their children from what was happening. So it wasn't just the Pedro Pan children. Entire families were leaving, right? The Pedro Pan children represented those families who were in a situation where for some reason they couldn't all leave, or the parents couldn't leave, or they had the chance to send the children and they didn't want to miss that chance, and they would figure it out how they would get out later, or the kids, when you get there, send a visa waiver to me, whatever it was. But entire families were leaving, right, for that same reason. It wasn't like, these special families were picked by the CIA, to send their kids over, right? This was, and it continued, Look at the freedom flights later. There was a second parallel time, so to speak, to Spain in the mid-1960s, early 1970s. That was 6, 7, 8 years into the revolution, and parents were saying, and Jan Gonzalez was going to put him on a rack to get him out of Cuba how many years later. This continued, right, and the Cuban government's depiction of it, of course, is absolutely absurd. I'm at like 14 minutes. Go. Thank you. Mr. Baker's son is here. Chris. Mr. Baker, Chris's father, in 1993 or 1994, when I was still, I think, a minor. And he was wonderful, and again, and I wish I had more time to talk more about him, and more about Walsh and how they cooperated and how they did all this. He was an extraordinary figure and you know, rescued 14,000 kids from
continue this wonderful history that Victor has outlined, because it has an enormous tail end. But sparing you the details of that tail end, what I'd like to do is to approach Pedro Pan Airlift from inside my own experience and how it relates to the larger picture. What happened to the parents is a question that always just won't leave me. I'll start with this story. I was telling my life story to an Ecuadorian in Madrid some years ago. Nobody, of course, had ever heard of the Pedro Pan Airlift. So I'm telling him the story, and he starts crying. And I say, you don't have to cry. Everything turned out wonderfully for you. And he says, you idiot. I'm not crying for you. I'm crying for your father, who never got to see you again. Boom. Hit me like a ton of bricks. All right. So, here's the story of my family. I already had one first cousin who was given a 30-year sentence and was in prison. His father was arrested during the Bay of Pigs invasion and tortured. Every morning, he was told in the Cabana fortress, when you hear the firing squad going off outside, that's going to be your son. Every single day. I had another cousin who was shot dead by Che Guevara and his firing squads. Grabbed his crotch and said, shoot here, cabrones. Final words. It was middle class. I guess some might say upper middle class. But we fit a certain pattern that Victor has outlined. My parents decided to send us away when the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution was set up right next door to us. And they were pestering my parents, why aren't you sending your children to school? Because here's a little footnote. All the schools in Cuba were taken over by the government and closed in April of 1961, right after the Bay of Pigs invasion. And there was no school from April 61 till September 61. My parents refused to send us to school, and they were under enormous pressure from our nice neighbors next door. And what did I see at my own school? I was in 5th grade in April 1961. We began in September of 61 with a nice full classroom. By the time April 61 rolled around, about 2/3 of the classroom was empty. One by one, my friends disappeared. Some left with their parents, some left on their own. As things would turn out, I ended up with just about every childhood friend that I had as a bit of one, except for one who couldn't leave and stayed, and is going to tell me later when he saw my brother and I leaving at the airport, because you can't be safe. By the way, they would put us in a glass fishbowl. That's all I'm saying. Just to torture us, our parents. Glass this big, couldn't talk to your parents. You had to get there early so that you could be strip searched. And you couldn't talk to anybody on the other side of the glass because the sound didn't carry through. So this friend of mine who didn't leave, Miguel Sales Figueroa, remained. He says to me, years later, when I published my memoir, you know, that day seeing you saying goodbye to you at the airport changed my life. It was my first step towards prison. And he ended up spending 8.5, maybe 9 years or so in prison. Many of those years spent totally naked because he refused to wear the same uniform as common criminals. Miguelito, I saw his textbooks because he was going to school, and I saw Miguelito's textbooks. I saw his math textbook, in which every math problem was politicized. I remember one very, very clearly. Jose Gonzalez used to pay his scumbag landlord so much for rent every month. Thanks to the urban reform, now Jose Gonzalez only has to pay so much. Thanks to our great illustrious leader, Castro el Comandante. What percentage reduction has he had in his rent? It was not education, it was indoctrination. I saw it with my own eyes. My parents saw it. My mom told me later, well, she was much older, we were already here in the United States, she decided to send me and my brother to the United States, not just because of the CDR next door, but because my brother and I would shout counter slogans at the pioneers who marched down our street. Uno, dos, tres, cuatro. My brother and I were chanting, uno, dos, tres, cuatro, comiendo miel. Wasting our time, basically. I was hiding behind a bush, I remember. We had to get shot. So we left. And here's the part of the huge tail end of the Pedro Pan airlift. In October of 1962, the missile crisis shut all doors. No one could leave Cuba. No one. According to one statistic that I have seen, when the doors were shut in October 1962, there were 80,000 Cuban children holding visa waivers. 80,000. There were 14,000 of us who got our leave, but there were 80,000 kids holding visa waivers in an island with a population at that time of only 6 million. I failed math in high school, so you do the math. It's a huge percentage of the population. This massive airlift completely transformed Cuba. That's part of the tail end. Those of us who left, and those of us who couldn't leave and left later, like my friend Miguel Sales, they were Cuba's future. Most of us came here, and, well, most of us did well. But what I'm trying to get at the other tail end, because I know I'm also running out of time, is the other part of the story, the other people involved. People who ran the Pedro Pan program, the camps. People who ran the Pedro Pan program in whatever the central office was. The man who waited at Miami Airport for every single plane. What's his name? George. Yeah. If you look at the exhibit in the next room, there's an entire wall with the names of the ones who left. That's his handwriting, I think, isn't it? Or someone associated over here. Yeah. So, people like him. People like Olita Grau and her brother who were cranking out the visa waivers in their house directly across the street from the G2, the government spy center, right across the street. According to one oral history I have heard, they were actually quizzed one time by the G2. They asked, what's all those lines of women lining up outside your house? So we're having a canasta fest. But that's not the truth. The truth is, they knew across the street what was happening, and they were very happy about it. Many years later, I got to sit next to one of Fidel's closest associates, Carlos Franchi, who was something of a wannabe propaganda minister, who ended up being purged and spent the rest of his life in exile in Puerto Rico. But he came to speak at Yale, and it was a long speech about Carlos Franchi was a good communist, and Fidel Castro was a bad communist, and that's why he had been expelled. But I got to sit next to him at dinner, and he sat right next to me. And I'd already had like 2, 3, maybe 5 glasses of wine. I was so traumatized by his presence. And I elbowed him and said, Tocayo, that's a Spanish word for someone with the same first name as you. Tocayo, tell me, you guys knew the kids were leaving. He said, of course we did. I said, well, what's your plan there? He said, with a big smile on his face. Anything that would destroy the bourgeois family was wonderful for us. More about the tail end. People took us in. I mean, there were many who spent a long time in the camps. Some of us spent very little time in the camps. Some of us were taken in by American foster families. Former Senator Mel Martinez is one of them. Some of us were sent to orphanages. Former ambassador to Spain, Eduardo Aguirre, was one of those. Went to an orphanage in New Orleans. Some of us were taken in by American families. And that history has not been told. I was taken in by an American family in Miami, in Westchester. My brother was taken in by another family. They were friends of my family. They brought us together. They lived about 10 blocks apart. Louis and Norma Chake. They deserve a monument. Sorry. Lou and Norma had just adopted 2 babies. And they took me in. I spoke barely any English. All I could say is when Norma served a beautiful turkey my first day there, all I could say in my broken English is, I don't eat chicken. She tried to explain to me, yeah, this is not a chicken, it's a turkey. I don't eat birds. They were Jewish. I learned some English really very quickly. I also learned some Yiddish that I thought was English. I discovered it was not English until I moved later to Bloomington, Illinois. And Lou and Norma, I hated church and religion as a child. I just hated it. To me, there was no scarier or nastier place than a church. Lou and Norma forced me and my brother's foster parents, also Jewish, forced him to go to St. Brendan's Church every Sunday. And they gave us money to put in a collection plate. And my foster father, Luke, was an atheist. Who later told me, many years later, his family had come to the United States from Russia before it became the Soviet Union. But one of his uncles had been shot dead at his doorstep by a Cossack, just because he was Jewish. So Lou and Norma understood the whole story. They were the sheep, and Norma were children of Jewish immigrants. How many other Americans are there like whose story has not been told? They took us in. In the case of Lou and Norma, they expected to have us for only a few months. our mother, because our father was not given permission to leave until much later in the 1970s when he developed heart disease. Then it was okay for him. Our mother had an exit permit for November 5th, 1962. The door closed on October 26th, 1962. But an uncle of ours, one of my father's brothers, had arrived just at the last possible minute. And he was resettled by the Cuban refugee program to Bloomington, Illinois, right smack in the middle of the state. Home of Eureka vacuum cleaners, State Farm insurance, and beer nuts. He couldn't take us in October. So we were put in this well-organized chaos. We were put in a foster home, also in Miami, about 3 blocks from the Orange Bowl, run by a Cuban couple, married couple that had no children of their own. But half of the children in that tiny little house had already been in trouble with the police or actually spent time in juvenile prison. It was not a nice place. We were supposed to be there temporarily, but the social worker forgot about us. And we spent 9 lovely months there. Until one day a social worker walks in and says, "What are you boys doing here? Casa ID? Why are you with your uncle?" My brother and I said basically that he was a teenager. Within 2 weeks, we were with our uncle in Bloomington. And then 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days later, our mom arrived. And she was sent to Chicago. And, lo and behold, I find myself in Chicago, attending a public high school where all these Cuban kids keep arriving. Many of them were Pedro Pan kids who were being reunited with their parents, and their parents, like my mom, was being sent to Chicago. Later, at some Pedro Pan reunion, I met the 3 of them who had moved to Miami. And that's when I found out they were Pedro Pan. I didn't know them in my high school. We didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about this to each other, which is, I think, part of that tail end. But to bring this to a close, I'm already over time. By 1 minute. That tail end is so important. The tail end is so important, not just for the history of the Cuban exile community, the history of Cuba, but the history of the United States. I saw the figures for all the unaccompanied minors that were streaming in across the border for the last 2 years. And those numbers just floored me. I could not conceive of what was happening. But the sad truth is, the world is so screwed up that many of the countries on earth deserve a Pedro Pan program. And parents would be willing to do this, send their kids, not knowing what awaits them at the other end. Freedom is that precious. You know, many of my classmates that are growing up going through high school and college here in the United States, they didn't understand. Some of them thought my parents were cruel. And I remember once at a conference at the German historian in Germany, who said that your parents were horrible, couldn't understand. Well, of course, he was in West Germany at the time. The wall was still there. Could have been an East German historian. He wouldn't have said that. Every time I meet someone from the former Soviet Empire, we have much to discuss. And it's important for the history of the United States. This exhibit here is a wonderful thing. Museums that showcase this part of history, it's so important. I'll close with this, another anecdote. Summer of 2009, I go on an alumni tour with Yale alumni. Most of them, or all of them, very well heeled. in Czechia. I'm blown away by the beauty. I'm also blown away by one fact. What did my mom say to me repeatedly? We're sending you to the U.S. so that you don't end up in Prague. Because kids were being sent to Prague. I know one Beverhead alum, a woman, who was going to be sent to Russia, to the Soviet Union. And that's where her parents decided to do it. So anyway, I find myself in Prague, just marveling at the beauty of the city. Remembering the photos of the Soviet tanks in 1968. We're taken somewhere, I think we're in the theater where part of Amadeus was filmed. Some of the concert scenes were filmed in Prague. And one of the alums, over 80, asks our tour guide, who was Czech, "Hey, I keep seeing posters throughout Prague for the Museum of Communism. Have you been there?" He says, "I don't need to. I lived it." That's the story of all Cubans. Even the ones that are arriving today, they may no longer be subjects of the former Soviet Empire. But in tiny miniature, that island of now 10 million people, because in the last 3 years, about 1 million have left, most of them young. The future of deep. In miniature, somehow, that repressive communist regime has managed to stay in power, making life miserable for everyone who lives in the island, except for the ruling elites. I always tell my students who question me about communism, what should I read? I say, read 1984, read Animal Farm, George Orwell. Couldn't have described it better. And I have a little poster of George Orwell outside my office. Because my profession is being turned into an agency of communism. The kind of history that is now being written, the way that the students are being trained, the things they write about, Marxists. We have many prizes for senior essays at Yale. We have about a dozen for American history. European history only has 3 prizes. American history has 12. But I've been keeping track over the past decade. The vast majority of the senior essays that win prizes have 3 words in the title: race, class, gender. Race, class, gender. Either all 3 words or just one. And last year, 2 of the 3 European prizes went to race, class, gender. So the quote I have from George Orwell: "He who controls the past controls the present. He who controls the present controls the future." This museum, it's like a nuclear bomb against the past, not retold, but the past told as it should be. So thank you to everyone here in the museum.
There's not much more that can be said about after that, but I know you'd like to hear a few words from the curator of this incredible exhibit. So to help me welcome Carmen.
Okay, I'm putting in the bad position of having to follow this too. But I'll do my best. Okay, our story, the story of Pedro Pan, starts in Cuba, BC, which stands for before Castro. And you'll see photos of our very happy life that we lived before all this happened. And you'll see photos of our happy childhood, and you will see things from our schools. Most of us, 93% of us were Catholic, and then there were 396 Jewish Peruvians. There were also about 700 Protestant, but we were families of faith. Most of us went to private Catholic schools, so when they closed the schools, we had to go to the school that the government had run, and so it was teaching Marxism. So then most of us did not go to school for about a year or two, as long as it took for us to leave the island. And then you will see what our parents' objections were. You will see the films of the trials, impromptu trials, and the executions and all that. And we were watching on TV, actually. You know, the children seem to watch the TV programs, and all of a sudden they would be interrupted with executions, public executions. And so our life started to change. Our parents objected to that, and you will see where returns to their objection. And then, of course, we started to leave Cuba, and we left with documents. We were documented. That's why not one of us were lost. Our parents always, they always knew who our parents were, and they always, we always knew where they were, and they always knew where we were. So not one of us was lost. And so that was very important. You will see our documents. We were required documents to leave Cuba and documents to come here. So we had passports, we had visa waivers, we had certificates of vaccination. No one would have an illness and be admitted in the United States. So we had all these. We had certificates of authorization from our parents to travel alone. So you will see all the documents that we brought, and then you will see our arrival in the United States, and then our life in the United States. And finally, we start with all the schools that we went to, and this is a part that I enjoy because our parents had the last laugh. You know, all the schools that they closed in Cuba, they were open in Miami. And so now we're very happy that my sons went to Belen. They closed Belen with my sons and my grandchildren went to Belen. They closed Los Marista, but Max grandchildren go to Columbus, which is similar to Los Marista. He was able to graduate from La Salle. So all those schools that they closed, they're in Miami, and our children and our grandchildren are able to get an education, the education that our parents planned for us, and so they were able to have that success. So with that, we also have a wall with all the names. There's an airport log where George Bush would write our names every day, the day that we arrived, and our names. And so we did that wall with a map of the places where we were sent, and also our names were all there on that wall. And then we have finally the Maleta project, which is, we have an artist, Mano Noveda, and he drew this, he has this, many drawings that he did of different Peruvian scenes, and so we have this one with the Maleta project, and then there's a Maleta that we Peruvians are going to sign. There's one particular for this exhibit, and then we will get to sign, and our children to get to sign the Maleta project. So that's it.
Well, this exhibit wouldn't be possible without the faithful patronage of a number of people, but the person who's invested so much and had the vision about the need, not just to tell this story to commemorate the past, but because he's deeply, deeply concerned about shaping Americans in the West today. Would you help me welcome him to come and say a few remarks?
Wow. Take a deep breath because the night is getting too emotional when I do these things, but before I go any further, let me tell you, this would not be possible without coming from the evening. So we thank you. I cannot imagine how many hours she spends day and night making sure that this happens. She understands how important it is. By the way, my name is Max Alvarez. My story is very important because my story is one of many millions of stories of people who not only came from Cuba, but people who have come from all over the world, the most generous country in the world. So I would like to take this opportunity, hopefully without getting emotional, talking as fast as Norman, because when I start talking fast, the vocabulary suffers, so that we don't be somewhat vulgar. about work. She will do it for the next week. That's her point. She never knows it's on the phone. But anyway, that being said, first of all, we need to thank God because we're here. And that is amazing. Personally, Mom and Dad, I was blessed to be born to the best parents for it. Mom and Dad only had 6 years education. They knew what it was like to live in a totalitarian government without freedom. So, they left their country, they arrived in Cuba as teenagers by themselves. My father came to Cuba at age of 18, never went back to Spain. And when he was about to enjoy the fruit of the labor, breaking happened for one day to the next. Again, my story is the same as ministry. But I'm here to thank God, my father, because they knew that no matter where I was going to end up, it was going to be a much better place than where we're at. And they had experienced that. They knew what it was like to be under the totalitarian government. So for that, I will be eternally grateful. Thank God we're able to come almost 4 years later. Just to show you how blessed we are, all of us. Just the fact that we're here, we're very blessed. You find somebody called Cura Walsh, my dad. I would have adopted that because he was able to really supplement the very family values that I was provided by my mom and dad. It starts at home, not in school. I only had a 6th grade education. I consider him, by far, the best philosopher I ever met. Never went past probably 6th grade. He didn't have to read. We had, But my father, with a pinch on my arm, 5, 6 years old, pinch your arm, he's on you that hurts. When he said his Spanish accent, he would say, pues hombre, si así ya se toca nosotros, le va a doler igual. So just to show you, in matters of seconds, my dad teach me how to treat other people. Now, do you realize if we knew, or if we were willing to treat other people the way when we treated, we would never have a war. We would never have an enemy. Because we treat other people the way we like to be treated. I learned that from a man who didn't have a 6th grade education. And I'm going to make this very quick. Because again, if I start thanking everybody to whom I owe my success personally, and everybody here, they would definitely, they gave me well doing because they want me to teach class. It's amazing. My parents come almost 4 years later. And, you mentioned it before, we were young kids, we adjusted very quickly. But imagine the courage of mom and dad to send a kid somewhere with no money, without a language. They didn't know how to speak the language. But they knew that we were going to end up, whatever it was, better than what we had. So 4 years later, my parents come. By the way, I was, again, blessed. I lived with Monsignor Walsh the entire 4 years that I was here. They never sent me anywhere. The reason was simply, they didn't know, because I was destined to go to Spain with my brother. So, I never ended the problem because the day that I left Cuba, my brother died in Spain. So he kept me here, and they didn't know we were going to go back to Cuba again. So, but 4 years later, my parents come, and I remember they went to the refugee center. They moved about whatever the case may be. After they did the paperwork, whatever, they had on my dad $100 bill. Remember, they only had the clothes that they were wearing. And my dad says, no, I don't want it. My mother turns around to him and said, Lucas, they give you $100. My name had nothing. I mean, that heavy Spanish accent, he turns to my mom and says, pues hombre, no vine aquí para buscar limosnas. I didn't go here for handouts. And he refused to open mouth. Then again, my philosopher, you read about dignity. I didn't even know how to spell the word back then. I was a kid. But that I will never forget. Look what is happening today. We bring people here, we don't even know who they are, and they don't expect, they demand. What happened in our country in the last 4 years had nothing to do with immigration. It's called an invasion. And it was a plan to destroy this very country of ours. That's what we need to be here, that's what we need to fight. You said, we need to know the past, we need to make sure that we bring it to the present, because this is our future. Our future depends on our children and our education. That's the most important, and we cannot wait until college or high school. We need to start in kindergarten. So, thank you very much. Very quickly, I usually get plaques and trophies for things that we have accomplished. And every time I get a plaque or a trophy, you know, start laughing inside, you know. It was nothing. My wife, my kids, and all the people around that I consider not only family, but other people. So, thank you.
You heard Max make the
Or
important,
to celebrate a lot.
you heard Max make the important point that this exhibition needs to be tied to the way that we talk to children, and the way that we talk to youth, and the way that we talk to others. So I want to let you know that this is not, this exhibition is not divorced from the other regular activities that we have here at VSC. In fact, it's deeply, deeply tied. We have a set of witness videos. Max is one of them, in which we've recorded the stories of people who know this story. Our high school curriculum, which is tied to national standards, has an entire chapter that's based on the Cuban experience and the Cuban American experience. And it tells the story very, very well. By the way, there's a whole set here of the terrible quotes by Castro and Che, and then they're compared with quotes about liberty from great Americans. We tell the truth. For younger students, these younger students, Max, we don't have a plaque for you. I'm going to give you this tonight. Communism and its crimes, teaching through history and fiction. It talks about these terrible dictators like Castro, like Pol Pot, like the others. There's a 1 week set of lesson plans for kids, for school kids, for younger kids. And then there is a novel with a book study for the parent. And if you can see that, this is the Pedro Pan book, The Red Umbrella. The children's book. There's a study guide right here so that a parent, a teacher can lead their kids right through that. So no plaque. So let me just wrap us up with a couple of instructions and then a request. In a few moments, we'll close. We're going to ask the Pedro Pans to go right through the store to take a photo of just that group in front of the exhibit. And Claire from our team, well, she's just going to be very direct. She's just going to tell you what to do when you get that way. And everyone else, if you go that way to some refreshment and then come to the exhibition that way through that door, we'll all end up over there sooner or later tonight. We have a wonderful pianist with us who's going to provide some music during our time of fellowship. But I want to ask you, as we leave, for three things. The first one is this, and that's a request to the Pedro Pans that if you'd like to come back tomorrow, anytime between 10 and 4, in our conference room, there we are set up to film interviews. And if you would like to tell your story, and many of you are in the beautiful documentary or that you're in other films, but if you'd like to come here and tell some of your story and us record it, we would love to do that. show up between 10 and 4. We started today with Mel Martinez earlier today, and we're putting these on video. Second thing, we're a very new museum. We only opened just 3 years ago this summer, and you could help us by telling people to come here, by referring people to our website, by referring people to our social media. And I'm going to send you a link this week. We'll send everyone who RSVP. We'll send you one email that shows you where the links are for the history videos and for all of those types of things, how you can get to our Amazon bookshop if you want to show the curriculum to people, etc. And then the third thing is to consider giving to us for this line of work. You know, unlike the other big museums in town, we don't receive a congressional appropriation every year. We are an entirely nonprofit, 501c3, independent educational institution. And we can't do the work without generous patrons, generous donors who help us out, foundations and others. And so, and by the way, my staff would love to help you if you need help understanding the different ways you can give. They'll give you a QR code. They'll give you a little envelope, like you said. They'll show you the website. I have a very helpful team. But seriously, you can help us out by thoughtfully considering whether or not this is a